Welcome back to the Keep Going podcast with Vin Kennedy. I'm your host, Vin Kennedy. Today we have a very special guest. This is Zach Bitter. Zach, you want to do a brief intro on yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Vin. Yeah, I guess I'm doing a few things these days. Most of it centered around running related stuff, but I am a professional ultramarathon runner, coach, and podcast host. So kind of got into ultra running around 2010. And that was after doing kind of more standard distance stuff in high school and college. Really kind of fell in love with the longer stuff. So started making that kind of the primary focus of training. And that was, unbeknownst to me at the time, a potential career move. So I ended up, eventually stepping away from a teaching job that I was had been doing for about 5 years, 4 years full time, and kind of focusing on training and racing and building up my coaching business. And that kind of led to the podcasting side of things. So it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's awesome. And yeah, I know you were a teacher, and I was going to say, like, when was that kind of, that tipping point where it was like, okay, well, this is now a career.
Yeah, it really came. It was a kind of couple things. I started thinking about it around maybe 2014-ish, around that time frame, like late 2014. And it was just I didn't really have any aspirations of like coaching one-on-one, at least at the time. I coached track and cross country for middle school and high school during my teaching years. But once I started having some results ultra running, I had some friends and just people who were kind of following the sport reach out and ask if I'd coach them. And I ended up building up like a fairly large group of coaching clients over about a year and a half. And it just started to become a situation where it was tough to balance both at a full-time capacity. So I kind of knew I had to really, if I wanted to be really good at one or the other, I had to pick. So being that racing professionally was probably the shorter career and one that's going to favor some youth, I thought I should probably capitalize on that while I still could. And then if I ended up not liking it or not being good enough to continue doing it, or ultimately just, finish that up, I could always go back to teaching, whereas that wouldn't be an option with training. So since, that freed up a lot of time to also kind of keep building my coaching program and stuff like that, there's only so much running you can do before you got to start resting. So I like to stay busy. So I always did want to have some other things, but just things that I could control a little more. So the coaching and podcasting stuff is just a little more easy to manage from a schedule standpoint. There's a lot less fixed time frame stuff like there was with teaching, where you had some good breaks in the summer and on weekends and holidays and things like that. But then when you were there, you were there. So like if the race schedule didn't line up well with that, I couldn't really manipulate it very easily. And so I think it was 2015, my last year of teaching. Probably midway through the school year, I had a co-teacher who I became pretty good friends with, and he was an interesting guy. He had kind of traveled around. He had actually been a drummer. Well, he still was a drummer for bands and things like that. So he sort of had like a sense of the more like independent contractor style lifestyle. And he was just like, "What are you waiting for, man? Go do it." Because at the time I was like, maybe I'll teach one more year and then see where I'm at there. And he kind of gave me the nudge to actually kind of go after a little sooner than I maybe would have otherwise. So I signed my first contract that was of any like significance around that same time, and that was a 3-year setup. So I thought, okay, I've got 3 years to kind of learn if this is something I want to continue to do and go from there. So far it's kept rolling. So I can't complain.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And what was like the real like turning point as far as like, was it a race? Was it a specific run? Like what hit you that you were like, oh, I have talent in this?
Yeah, what really was interesting to me was when I first jumped into ultra running, I didn't jump into like some of the bigger races right out the gate. I just went for what was kind of around where I was living, for the most part. And I did realize that in the sport of ultra running, although it is different in the sense that, anytime you get into kind of more of a fringe sport, you're just going to have less numbers. So if if you have any like leanings towards being better at that than say shorter distance stuff, you're probably going to find yourself doing a little more winning than you would have when it's a little bit of a bigger pool of people to compete against. So I started winning some like lower regional races and things like that. That didn't really spur like a professional career or career switch mindset, but I did do a race in 2013 at the end where I broke an American record and a world record, for 100 miles American record, 12 hours for world record. And that was probably the first race that really got me enough attention to start kind of thinking about like what I wanted to do with the sport outside of just having it be like this like very in-depth like hobby outside of teaching. And yeah, from there I kind of also learned that like ultra running is just this very complex like type of events where it's really almost silly that we consider it all one sport, because you can do anything from like a 50K up to like multiple days, if not weeks and months, depending on how crazy you want to get with it.
Sure.
So you could be really good at one aspect of ultra running and really bad at another. And, you know, you see that from time to time. And I think as the sport continues to grow, we're probably going to see more specialization within that. But for me, one of the things that kind of stood out was I was living in Wisconsin at the time. So in the Midwest, didn't have a lot of mountains and, you know, steep technical trails to train on and things like that. So I was doing a lot of my training on roads. And I started to recognize that when you're training in those environments, racing in something similar to that can be a little bit of an edge versus trying to replicate a course that you don't have access to in training. And I started just focusing on more runnable courses, realized I kind of actually liked that setting a fair bit too. So just sort of leaned into that a little heavier and started having a little more success when I was able to kind of focus in on like a specific type of racing a little more than another versus trying to be a little bit more of a jack of all trades, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. And that 100 miler was I believe you ran that at like 650, right?
That first one, I think I averaged like, I want to say it was like 7:04. Then I went back to that same event a couple of years later and averaged about a 7. Then would have been about 5.5 years after that. I ended up averaging 6:47.5. So it sort of took me a little while, but I got it down there into the 6:40 range.
And you said something on, I believe it was when you were on with Joe Rogan, that is like was absolutely, I'm chasing a sub 3 marathon, and
Oh, cool.
you ran 4 back to back to back to back. And when you said that, I was like, it just, so I guess there's two ways people could look at that, right? Where it's like, wow, Zach Bitter's a way better athlete than me, or look at what Zach Bitter is making possible, right? Where it's like
Mhm.
that sub 3, you did that 4 times in a row without stopping. And I think it's so cool. And when it opens your eyes to like possibility rather than like lack of what I don't have, it's awesome.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely interesting sport because speed is a component to it. I think there's probably like a certain amount of speed that is required to get in the room, so to speak, when you're looking at kind of running specific times or getting podiums at certain races and things like that. But that's just one much smaller variable than it would be for like say the 5K or 10K, amongst a ton of other ones. So then like you get into other things, just like your ability to sustain a relatively low intensity for a very long period of time, you're managing of nutrition, logistics, the mindset of all of it, all the things that kind of go in and make ultra running unique. And then course stuff too. So like, you know, it's a lot different running on a 400-meter track round and round and round versus going up and down steep technical mountain trails. So there's a lot of variability in there too. And what makes one good at one doesn't necessarily make them good at another either. So uh, there's a lot of skill set development. I think that's maybe a little unique, especially when you get into like kind of the trail side of things.
Yeah. And it's funny too, because something that I think is so cool, especially with the sport as a whole, is that like some days it's just not your day, right? Like where there are other sports where it's like no matter how many times I play LeBron James in basketball, like I'm just not going to beat LeBron James.
Yeah.
But there are some people that show up to some of these races and have enough talent to, if that day the top people just don't have it, you could win.
Yeah, and then you see that a fair bit more probably in ultra running, just because there is a big cost to an early mistake. Because it's just the amount of time you have to pay for that mistake can get extrapolated out to hours and hours. Uh, and then you have other things just like wear and tear on your body or injuries and things. You could be the best runner on the field by a long shot, but if you bust your ankle on a downhill descent, it's like, you're out. So I think it's
Right.
yeah, so you always got to kind of keep your head in it if you're in a race like that has a lot of competition. Because sometimes, I mean, we've seen everything in this sport. I mean, one of the most notable probably examples of that would have been like the 2016 Western States 100. This guy Jim Walmsley, who's uh, been one of the best ultra runners in North America for quite some time. He was way ahead of everybody in that race, and he took a wrong turn. He went off course by a fairly large margin, and then ended up. I mean, he was on razor's edge. He was like way ahead of course record pace, and that course can be brutal because it gets really hot, sometimes 100 degrees in this canyon section. So if you make a mistake and it he can crack you very quickly. So he ended up finishing, but like 18th place when he was very much on pace to break the course record by a fairly large margin. And just like one decision was the difference between that within the context of would have been like around a 14-hour day. So it's like, it is pretty crazy how much of a difference it can make just to kind of keep yourself in it, I guess, with even if it looks like you're way out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like, what does something like a DNF do to you, your mindset, and like how does it affect you these days compared to how it might have in the past?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think this actually changes to some degree depending on where you're at, both in kind of the short term and the long term, because I think this is a fairly common trend with ultra runners, whether you're competing professionally or if you're just there because it's a sport you enjoy, is when people get into the sport, there's like this little bit of an incentive, I think, to not DNF. It's like kind of part of the culture of just being tough and kind of being able to endure. So like getting to that finish line at all cost is sort of embedded in it to some degree. And I think like early on that stays there. And then ultimately what usually happens is someone will eventually have something happen which requires a DNF. Hindsight can maybe clarify whether it was actually necessary or not. Sometimes it very much is. Other times it's like a little more gray area. Other times, I mean, I can say this for myself. I look back and like, I probably could have stuck that one out a little bit longer. And then you kind of get into this mindset of like DNFing is an option. Before like you did, it kind of wasn't. It was just like the expectation going in was that you're going to arrive at the finish line. It may not be your best day, it may not be in the time you wanted, but you're going to get there. So that kind of opens up a door that you have to navigate going forward that you didn't before, which is like being a little more conscious of whether you actually need to DNF or not, because you do have a series of like ups and downs throughout these things where, sometimes it can be something where if you just ride it out a little bit, you may feel better and run a really good race. And other times, it may be something where you just didn't have it for one, you made a mistake that was just going to be not worth finishing that particular one because you have other opportunities down the road, or because that mistake was going to be consequential enough where you end up not being able to train and race for a while if you keep pushing through it. And you have to kind of look at it a little differently at that point. So for me, I think like I am always balancing that. I think there are times where like a DNF is a justifiable decision from just a sustainability standpoint in the sport, from a professional standpoint, just because you don't want to necessarily like take away other opportunities, especially if the race you're DNFing in isn't your goal race or your big race of the year. And then there's also though, like, I don't think you want to necessarily find yourself in a situation where you're stringing together DNFs either, because that just eats at your psyche. And I think it puts you in a position where then you start getting a little trigger happy on DNFing. So, I had a stretch of races, I think it was end of 2017, early 2018, where I had a few DNFs in a row. And some of them were like weird, where I went like way off course. And it was just like, oh, okay, like in order to finish this race, now I'm going to be running like significantly further and really not get any actually value add from a training standpoint, because any adaptations I would have gotten on the day have been far already checked. And then it was like, I'm better off dropping here and then finding myself on a starting line down the road. But then I got to a point where it's like, you do that a few times in a row. And it's like, this next race, I don't care. I'm just going to finish it because I need to finish a race so that I can kind of get this thing back on the track and get that positive, mindset of arriving at a finish line, regardless of whether it's where you want to be or not, and string a few of those together too. So I think you want to navigate that well too, because otherwise you just end up kind of not enjoying the thing you're spending a ton of time and energy into.
Yeah, it's almost like having like the confidence to quit, right? And like understand
Yeah.
that it might be worth delayed gratification for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What,
Mm-hmm.
what kind of like tips do you have for someone that wants to start and then for advanced runners just to get better as a whole?
Yeah, I think like when you're getting started, there's a lot more of a incentive to put like have like a tiered goal setup where if we're looking at just from like the end product, like especially when you get to like the 100-mile and beyond distance, when I'm working with someone who's new, I usually tell them make sure you have a goal of just to finish, because there's a lot you can learn even from a bad experience or what you consider a subpar experience to what you were trying to get from a time standpoint or a finishing position standpoint that you can build off of, that you're not going to be able to experience in training when you're stretching these distances out that long. So like there's really no way to practice perfectly like mile 70 to mile 100 in training. So if it's somebody who's new and maybe they make a mistake and get out a little too fast and drop out at mile 70 versus what we call death march it in, they may be better off death marching it in, because then they can kind of wrap their head around like, oh, I death marched the last 30 miles because I went out too fast for the first 40. And I know that because I never got things going again after mile 70, versus someone who just has a rough patch at 70, gets through it after 2 miles, ends up running really strong for the last 28. You learn a lot in that end stage of a 100-miler. So I think when you're new, getting that full experience is important. Or a situation like I described before, if you're in if you have removed yourself so far from like having a race that you actually got to the finish line for in a reasonable position, it could be like a good benchmark to set for yourself, just to like get that full experience again. And then from there, it's a lot easier to build from that, because once we have that full picture, we can go back and say, okay, what did we do that arrived at that? What did we do that produced that? And make the changes and be a lot more reasonable about the things we change versus things we don't change. Because it's a lot of times it's easy just to like throw everything out the window on a bad day and say, okay, I got to train completely differently because that didn't work, versus, oh, that actually did work, but my mistakes were made on race day, or that worked for about 90%, but I do really need to like adjust these things around 10% of stuff in order to really kind of figure out where I want to be or get to where I want to be. And that just gives, I think, a lot better of or a smaller list of variables to like have to try to manage and lean into, or line up what I like to call like your strengths and weaknesses and things like that when you're kind of planning for the next one. Then you get to someone who's a little more experienced. I think we already have that list to a large degree. So then it is kind of just like leaning on their body of work to date a little more heavily and building from there, and then setting expectations that are maybe just a little more precise. So that more advanced experienced runner, it's like you can sort of have a little bit of a tighter range of what I'd call maybe your A, B, and C goal, because we already kind of know essentially like to some degree where their potential lies. If you look at it from just the training side of things in general, I think one of the bigger mistakes runners oftentimes make, and I don't think this is necessary, this is just like a reality of the way that people get drawn into probably any running related sport, is usually someone draws you into it. So you come in new, unexperienced, without a lot of knowledge, and it's a lot easier just to parrot what you see versus actually do what you need to be doing to meet yourself where you're at. So whether it's someone who's got an experienced running background or is really new to running, decides I'm going to get into ultra running because that's the area of the running sport that really draws them, you got to look at it from like a micro stressing standpoint of where you're at, and then start there, so that you're never putting yourself in a position where you're overreaching so frequently enough in training that you're creating like these large stressors. I call them hero workouts, where you go and you just like kind of run yourself dry in one workout, and then it ends up costing you future workouts. And then over the course of say 16, 20, 24 weeks, you end up actually doing less quality at the intensities you're targeting, because you're just always chronically missing the goal intensity or the actual design of what you're trying to do. So the easiest way to make sure you minimize those mistakes is to make sure you're being honest with where you're at, whether that's like the amount of volume you've run historically, or the amount of speed work you've done historically, like what types of speed work, where you tend to be like, this would be a strengths and weakness thing. Like some people, they respond very well to speed work. They're pretty durable with it. I can throw a little bit more at them and I'm less likely to have some risk situation flare up, versus someone else who it's like, I got to be very careful with them around speed work because they may get injured a lot more easily, or burn out and fatigue a little bit more easily if I lean into too heavily. So it's going to be a little bit of a different timeline or a little bit of a different incremental stressor with that. So trying to remove the person from being like too married to just replicating what they saw someone else do or what their friend is doing who's been doing it for a while, and make sure that we're kind of bringing them to where they're at and then starting from there. Same kind of thing, like with the trail running side of the sport, you'll see this too, because it'll be like these courses have a ton of climbing and descending. And one of the questions I'll get a lot of times is like, well, how many feet should I climb per workout or per week in order to be ready for this course that has 20,000 feet of climbing and descending? And I try to back them up. So that's kind of the same question of how many miles should I run to be ready for a 100-mile race? It's like, it doesn't really matter. Like there probably is like a reasonable target that like you should probably get to this in order to feel like you've checked the boxes appropriately. But whatever that is, it's sort of irrelevant if you're jumping steps to get there. So you, whether it's about like how much elevation gain and loss to add to your training plan, or how many extra miles or minutes or hours, however you're going to gauge that, you always want to start at where you're at and then kind of go from least specific stuff to most specific stuff. And then weaknesses early, strengths later is kind of the timeline that I like to kind of generally follow when it comes to preparing for these things before you find yourself even on the starting line.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And something I think that's like key to touch on is in the ultra world, obviously like 100 miles or 50 or anything over, really. I feel like some people shy away from speed work. How do you personally feel about that?
Yeah, I think it's generally a mistake. If I mean, everyone has their own why. So like if someone is like, I hate speed work and that's why I'm doing ultra marathons, it's like, I mean, that's a perfectly fine why. Like if you don't want to do speed work and you're miserable doing it, fine, just go and run a bunch and you'll get to finish lines. But I think if you're looking at it purely through the lens of like, I want to be the best version of myself I can be from a performance standpoint, I think speed work is going to be important. It's just going to be a variable or an intensity that's not very specific to the intensity you're going to do at race day. So it would be kind of be the same way if I looked at like someone training for a 5K and they realized, okay, my 5K pace is the intensity I would do for short intervals. So I'm just going to do all short intervals. I'm not going to do any volume. I'm not going to do any long run development. I'm not going to do any threshold workouts. Just going to do short intervals every day, or every day I can tolerate. I'm going to do short intervals. I'm going to practice exactly what I'm going to be doing on race day. That's not going to get them to the finish line the fastest either, because they're missing key components that, even though they're maybe not as specifically important to the race intensity, they are important. So the way I look at it is, what is the opportunity cost of doing something in place of something else? So assuming the person comes to me and they've already got a pretty strong foundation, which is usually the case. Like I don't get too many people that are just new to running coming to ultra running, although it does happen and there is a path forward for those people. Most people that are coming to me, they're like, they've been doing some running, so they probably have a reasonably good foundation. If not, we'll spend some time working on that. But from there, we want to do speed work earlier in the plan, because it's going to be least specific, but it is going to improve their overall running fitness. So then when we do get to the part of the plan where we're going to develop the things that are specific to the racing. So if it's a 50-mile, like the intensity specific to what they'll be doing for that 50-mile, or if it's a 100-mile, or the intensity they're going to be doing specific to that, we have them in a position where they're optimized from just a general running fitness standpoint. So then when we start stacking the specific stuff on top of it, they're starting from a better spot, if that sort of makes sense. So I think as long as you're looking at it through the lens of most intensities are going to take about 4 to 6 weeks for adaptations to take place, and then the opportunity cost of, say, doing more base work when you already have a strong base foundation over short intervals when you're like 16, 20 weeks out from a race is very low, because you're just not close enough to the race to really need to be working on the specifics of race day yet in a large capacity. So trading out a few like lower intensity runs for a couple short interval or long interval sessions is worth it at that point. Now, when we get 6 to 8 weeks out from the race itself, if I'm giving someone like 2 short interval sessions per week, and the cost of that is they can't do enough volume at goal race intensity, or their long run is lower quality because they're too fatigued from the speed work we're doing, that's not a cost that I'm willing to give them, because it's not, the timeline doesn't match up for what we should be trying to develop at that point in time.
No, absolutely. And I think another thing that is like not overlooked, but like not often talked about is like, or over talked about too at the same extent, is like running form. So I feel like so someone comes to you as a coach, obviously there's no, like, I'm assuming from coaches I've worked with, it's not like you're sending videos of yourself running, like there's no specific form that's being watched. And do you think that more comes to just from like compounding and being consistent, you kind of just become more efficient? I know like obviously heel striking is a big, some people hate it, some people like say it's great with like vapor flies and certain shoes and whatever. But how do you kind of navigate that where people are like, well, my coach doesn't know my form, or is form important? Is really, I guess, the question.
Yeah, I mean, it's important, but it's also like there's going to be some variance from one individual to the next. So if someone is if you look at just like one aspect of form is like your foot, where your foot is striking the ground, people read into that one quite a bit because they're like, you get the forefoot, the midfoot, and the rear foot striking or heel striking, and then people will pinpoint flaws in any of it and all of it for the most part. Like heel striking gets probably the biggest negative connotation to it. And part of the reason for that is like if you're like really striking on your heel, like the way back of your heel, it's very difficult to do that if your foot is coming down underneath your bent knee. It's usually where you have what I like to call like a check mark stance, where your heel's coming down out in front of your knee and your toes are pointing up, and it almost forms like a check mark with your foot and your leg. Now you're taking on the load of that impact out in front with that straight knee. Those impact forces are going to be going up into the knees and the hips. And that's not exactly the way that you're probably mechanically going to be able to absorb those impact forces in a way that's going to be sustainable. So if a person their foot is coming down underneath their bent knee, whether it's kind of closer to the back half of their foot, the mid of the foot, the forefoot, that can be just maybe unique to their own running mechanics and their own body. So I'm a little more really kind of like looking at that than I am necessarily like, is this person just way off with their form because they're a rear foot striker versus a forefoot striker and that sort of thing. But I mean, there's a ton of other mechanical things that kind of come into running too, where you can have issues of just like the way your hip and pelvis is tilted in your running form and things like that create these little like angles in your running form that are going to like sort of attract impact forces into areas where you wouldn't necessarily want them versus where you would. But some of that stuff, it's going to be somewhat individual, but also like there's some general things I think you can focus on that everyone can focus on and really kind of start from. And then if they want to like work with like a physical therapist or a running form specialist, they can maybe get some cues that are very individual to their particular gait. And those are kind of like just like, where is like the top half of your body? Like, do you have like a slight forward lean? Usually you want just like a very slight forward lean. Where are your arms positioned in terms of like, are they swinging across your sternum, or are they kind of just like popping back and dropping forward, popping back and dropping forward? Because when you think about it, like you're trying to move forward. So when you swing your arm back, it's pushing you forward. When you swing your arm forward, it's pushing you back. You don't want to get pushed back. So I think when people think of arm swing, they think just vigorously swinging their arms, when in reality, you kind of want to pop it back and let it fall forward, so you're not fighting against the momentum you're trying to create. And then if you think of it just in terms of just like what we talked about before, is like, where is your foot striking in relation to your bent knee? And then ultimately, one that usually actually kind of addresses all of these to some degree is your cadence. Because everyone's going to have a bit of a unique range in cadence, where the slower they run, the lower their cadence to be, and the faster they run, the faster their cadence is going to be. But it's not going to be like this massive spread. It might be like 20 steps per minute or something like that. So like if you're kind of generally around 180, that's usually a pretty good target. If you start getting quite low, like down to like 160 or below that, there's a good chance you're overstriding, because like people sometimes think, well, if I take a bigger step, I'm covering more ground. It's like, yeah, you're covering more ground, but it's also taking you longer to do it. So then over a period of time, you're not actually getting any further, and you're creating that situation I talked about before, where your foot is coming out in front of your bent knee. So a lot of times someone who's just got like a overstriding issue, you can kind of correct that to some degree by just having them slowly work on bringing their cadence up. You don't necessarily want to go from a really low cadence to really low or high cadence overnight, because that's going to change so many different mechanics that the way that their body is currently like developed may create an injury from just overusing something that's been a little bit less activated in the past, or a little bit atrophied from lack of usage in that same exact mechanic. So bringing them up slowly is usually like a good approach with that. And a lot of times that increase in cadence will kind of help put them in those positions where they're no longer striding. So now their foot's going under bent knee. it's encouraging a little bit more of a forward lean in a lot of cases. And then just focusing on some of those other things, like the way they're positioning their arms and things like that, can also be little tips that kind of help get them to what is going to generally put them in the right position for their particular mechanic.
Right. No, absolutely. And another thing that I know is big and talked about a lot is like keto or carbs. And what's your take on this?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I think generally speaking, when people are thinking about this stuff, it's like, if you're looking, there's a few things to consider. I mean, they're both macronutrients. You have like your fat and then you have carbohydrates. So your fat, the advantage of that is it's plentiful. Like even the leanest endurance athletes have more than enough body fat to fuel a long event. Whereas carbohydrates, they're faster, but you have a very limited supply of them. So if you're going to rely on those heavily, you're going to have a conscious effort and a situation where you can be taking in a lot of exogenous carbohydrate during these longer events, because you're just going to need to replace that during the event. Then you want to look at it from an intensity standpoint in terms of like, well, what exactly are you doing? So like when you get into these ultra marathons, they're done at such low intensities, you're not necessarily compromised the same way you would be if you're, like, say, running a half marathon or a marathon, where it's pretty long, but it's also relatively intense. But it does get individual from there, in the sense that like you're going to have a specific intensity that you can sustain for the duration of whatever event you're doing. And from there, you're going to have a ratio of fats and carbohydrates that your body's going to require during that. So if you take somebody like myself who skews lower carbohydrate, I'm going to be burning higher amounts of fat than I will carbohydrates at the intensity I'm going to race at, versus me doing the same thing, but on a moderate to high carbohydrate diet. So for me, I think the question then becomes, it's like, well, how much fuel do you need at race day intensity? And if you're able to tolerate that from a carbohydrate intake standpoint, uh, and that's the way you prefer to eat, and that's how you feel best, great. Do it that way. If you can meet that exchange, that's fine. If you struggle to hit the amount of carbohydrate you're going to need to eat over the course of a race in order to meet that need, then you either need to learn how to, or you need to reduce that need. So then that's going to be some individual characteristics within that, where some people, I mean, there's some people who they do a low carbohydrate diet and they just prefer that way of eating anyway, and then they lower their need for carbohydrate at a given intensity on race day. So now all of a sudden they also have this logistical relief of not having to consume as much carbohydrate as they would have if they were eating more during their training and racing throughout the year. So for them, it's like, I like this better. It helps me on race day. There's no reason for me to try to work my way up to being able to tolerate that. And some people just simply can't too. I've worked with people too, like, have been like, I have no reason to believe that they're not trying to get in enough and
Right.
spread it out properly and do all the right things. And it just becomes like such a nightmare for them that they would much rather just, lessen the desire, or not the desire, but the need to do that, in terms of putting them in a position to not deplete that source. So I think if we put everyone in the same kind of plane, in terms of, we have limited glycogen stores on race day, and the next question is, what do we need to do to replace them? And can you replace them? What do you prefer? Those are all really good starting points. I think where people run into trouble is when they either prefer moderate high carbohydrate, they sort of have no problem fueling that way, and then they decide, okay, I'm going to go low carb keto because so and so told me to, and then they find out that that didn't really work very well for them because they don't enjoy it, they can't sustain it. Or the opposite, someone's on a low carbohydrate diet for some other reason outside of their training and racing, and then they get into running or ultra marathons. They think, okay, I got to start eating more carbohydrates because that's what I'm supposed to do in this. And that way of eating isn't very sustainable for them in their day-to-day life. They don't enjoy it as much. And then when they get around to trying to fuel like that, they end up having all these digestive issues and things like that. So that's sort of the other end of the spectrum. I just think there's probably enough individuality with that sort of thing, and preference too is probably a big thing. Because one thing I always ask people is like, whatever direction you think you want to go, you should ask yourself, like, how sustainable is this for me to continue to do? So, if it's somebody who's like, well, I'm just going to try a couple of these races and I want to do it as an experiment, like low carb keto, so I don't really care if I can sustain it for a long time or not, because once I finish doing this experiment, I'll decide whether I want to or not. That's one thing. It's a whole nother thing if someone says, I want to make this a lifestyle change that I'm going to do for presumably ever or for the foreseeable future. Then I think you have to be a lot more honest with yourself in terms of like, is this something that is going to fit the framework of kind of what works for me and what I can stick to in my lifestyle. And a lot of times I think that probably ends up being the biggest driver for most people, because most people are, they're not like professional athletes where they're controlling every variable of life to such a large degree around their race results that they can like step away from things like as simple as building the framework around making it a sustainable way of eating out of necessity for their career from a performance standpoint versus just like what the average person is going to be able to do when they're navigating their general life and things like that.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And this one's actually just a question that it just came to me this morning, and I've just been pondering it all day, and I'm curious your take on it. If you knew you'd hit every goal, how would that affect like your mindset and the process in trying to achieve those goals?
If I knew I was going to hit it,
Yeah. Like it's
um,
inevitable. You're going to hit everything you set out to do. How would that affect like you and your process?
yeah, that's a good question, because I would say that like generally speaking, the main value I think I get out of the sport is less to do with the race result and more to do with enjoying the process of kind of meeting these check marks along the way, which when compiled together, done right, will usually result in a better race performance. Just because I think there's so much you can learn from that process. Now, I don't know how I would see that if it was like if the race was a guarantee then. Um, I guess you'd probably still have the ups and downs in training of like, all right, I've got to do this short interval session, and inevitably I'm going to be questioning if I want to do all of them when I'm a third of the way through it.
Sure.
And then you still have to navigate that kind of back and forth in your mind, which I think is just a valuable skill set to continue to develop and work on for other areas of life. I mean, I think it would still take a lot of the excitement out of it all, though, because there's so much into even though like I don't think the end result is necessarily the end all be all, it is a glimpse into like the curiosity side of like, am I doing things right in training? Like one bad race is one bad race, but if you're like always running bad races, then you probably need to look at what are you doing and why is it not producing the results you're looking for, whether that be just like expectations that are larger than they should be, or just like poor execution on race day, or maybe just the training methodology you're following isn't matching up what you're trying to actually execute on race day. uh if you take that away, I think that maybe takes a little bit of the excitement out of it. So I'd have a hard time believing that I would be as motivated to kind of do the things I need to do, which is ironic in that situation, because like if it's guaranteed, then it's like, am I going to sit there and be like, well, if it's guaranteed, I'll do 70% of the work.
Right. Yeah.
Do I still get
I
that
know.
result?
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. I came to this morning and I was thinking about it, and it's like I'm with you. I like the idea of like failing forward and like
Yeah.
growing the process. I
Mhm.
feel like that's what makes it fun.
Yeah, I think like one of the more exciting things about some of the best races I've had is they've come after races that didn't quite hit the way I wanted. And some of them were good races. They just weren't like, when I looked back at the end, I was like, that was a mistake that probably led to that, or there was like kind of clear things that I needed to address in order to fix the mistake. And that was part of the excitement of eventually getting there, was that it wasn't like something that was just that came super easy.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of just segue into something completely different. Did you ever think when you originally started teaching that running would lead you to going on Joe Rogan, going on Lex Friedman, and like what was that experience like? Because that had to be really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I ever thought running was going to lead to anything other than personal enjoyment, much less Rogan and Lex's podcasts. Those were very kind of unique situations. I think, like, I mean, for me, I think they just show that the lesson I find from that was the running was something I was going to do. The question was to what capacity. So once I decided to what capacity, it was like, well, what else do I want to be doing along the way that I think is fulfilling and useful versus kind of like contrived and forced or feeling like I should be doing this. So like my unique, or I shouldn't say it's unique to me, I guess it's unique to basically anybody who's in a similar position to what I was in the same timeline, is like you have all these different avenues outside of just the training and racing to engage with people, engage with the sport. And the big ones are like social media, YouTube, podcasting, and all that sort of stuff. So that stuff has all just grown exponentially since I started, to the degree where when you started, you'd sign a contract based on race results essentially. And, you produce race results, you'd get in media outlets because of it. A brand could use you for marketing purposes because of those race results. And that was more or less what drove a lot of contracts. Now it's like that's a component or an arm of it, but there's also like your reach on social media, your ability to go on shows with big audiences and talk about the sport and share your insight and then the products you use and things like that. So I leaned a lot more into podcasting than I did the other social media stuff, just because I enjoyed that framework a lot more. It was fun to sit down and just talk to someone versus, a short blurb on a microblog or post a picture with a few sentences and that sort of stuff.
For sure.
Yeah, so I put a lot more focus on that, I think. And it was early enough in podcasting where podcasting was so small. I think I went on my first podcast probably around 2011, 2012 as a guest. And, just sort of followed that. I got into the low carbohydrate nutrition stuff, which probably made me stand out as different enough in this grand scheme of things, where like, I got recognized as the guy who's not eating a ton of carbohydrates when he's running, which was a little bit of a shock, I think, to a lot of people. And then the way that the Rogan and Lex Friedman podcast usually work is like they get interested in something, and then if that crosses their radar in terms of something interesting they want to talk about, then you get invited on. So I got really fortunate in 2017 that Joe got interested in what I was doing and asked if I wanted to come on. So I did that. And I mean, his podcast is so big, there's like a downstream effect of it, where once you go on there, the podcasting world essentially usually figures out who you are. So you end up on shows that are still rather large, but they're just, a bit below Joe. So then it's like you sort of get into the world of podcasting. But it was probably getting into the world of podcasting in the first place that, along everything else I was doing, that sort of led to that. So to me, it kind of just points this or the lesson there for me is just like, there's usually options in terms of how you want to engage with people and how you want to present yourself online and all of these other things. So find the ones that you actually enjoy doing and then lean into that enjoyment, because that's going to like foster an environment where you're consistent with it, where it feels meaningful enough for you, where it's sustainable. So you keep doing it year after year versus kind of doing it for a little bit, then getting sick of it and not doing it for a while and not having that kind of relative consistency. And then, you get to where you want to be, I guess.
So true, man. And honestly, it's like there's real value in it, right? Like sitting down and having the conversation rather than the quick posts and like the clickbait and like quick engagement. It's true.
Yeah. Yeah. And
So
I think
true.
there's value in some of the other stuff too. I think it's
Yeah.
just like from my interest standpoint, and then some of it I think has evolved enough too now where I get more interested in like take Instagram, for example. It's like you take a 60-second reel. It's like there is something cool and really, I think, interesting about being able to package, like deciding, first of all, what is your presentation technique? Like, some people are entertaining, they're very charismatic, so they can just hop on the camera and say just about anything and people are going to laugh and come along. Whereas other people maybe are just like, I've got something to share, some education. It doesn't matter if it's dry or exciting. If people want to know it, they're going to find it. But then how do you package it in 60 seconds in a way that kind of gets someone interested to go down the rabbit hole, so to speak, or to reach out? So like from someone like myself who does more podcasting than the other stuff historically, it's like, okay, like if I do a really cool Instagram reel that gets someone interested in a topic that then I do a long form podcast on, it can get someone into podcasting that maybe wouldn't have before. And then, you give someone, teach someone something like a little bit in a different way. So, yeah, it's an interesting environment with the internet for sure.
Really is. And even what you explained right there is kind of like leveraging the different platforms to kind of cultivate the other ones, which is a really unique way to go about it.
Mm-hmm.
And the last question is it's the name of the podcast. What keeps you going? So, like you said, that mile you run on a track for 100 miles, you got to have a deep why and something that keeps you kicking. What is that really for you?
Yeah, I think right now there's probably two main ones. And one is I think that there's still things that I can do in training that will maybe put me in a better position to run a faster time. So kind of navigating that, the exploration of trying those little things in training that are either going to work on the physical side of things or the mental side of things that puts me in a better position on race day. And then just like what I told myself, I think earlier on is like, if I run 100-mile race on a track and I feel like there's really no way I'm going faster than that, then I'll probably like, you know, sink my energy into a different distance or a different environment or something like that. Cause at that point it'll probably be less interesting. So that's another big thing, is just like not thinking like I've had my fastest 100-mile race yet. So there's still that desire. And I could be wrong about that. You know, I could end up not running any faster, in which case than it would have been, but I wouldn't have known that without trying. So I think like what keeps me going then is just like the thought that, or the idea that I can go faster, and the fact that I still enjoy the process of trying to solve that riddle in the 4 months or 6 months, however long it ends up being, to prepare for a specific race.
Yeah, man. Absolutely. And it's like the quest and being interested. It's right. Like the curiosity is kind of like really the underlining thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's what makes ultra running so fun too, is there is a lot of different options out there. So even with the 100-mile distance, if I decided I'm sick of preparing and racing on the short, or not short, but short loop, but more controllable courses, runnable courses, I could do a 180 and start training for more mountain races and climbing and descending type races. And I've taken breaks to do that in the past, just to kind of do a reset. And I find that to make it a little more sustainable. But if I decided that was like a permanent switch, there's still a lot to do in the sport and get excited about. So you can, I think at that point you can just be honest with yourself, where it's not like, I mean, I can appreciate and respect someone who's like a professional marathoner, because you get into that world and it's like, that's kind of your option, like this
Right.
road in this marathon. Like, and
True.
there's not a whole lot of like, you can maybe mix things up in training with some shorter races here and there just to kind of spice things up a bit. But ultimately, that target is 26.2 on a relatively controllable fast road. So, like, if you get sick of it, you kind of have to decide if you want to keep doing it or not. Whereas ultra runners can maybe just kind of switch the environment in which they're doing it and recreate that excitement to some degree.
So, so true. Yeah, man. Honestly, I really, really appreciate your time and learned a ton. But it's really, really refreshing that like, obviously DM'd you and like you answered and it's just
Yeah.
to take the time out. I seriously, I really, really appreciate it.
No, absolutely. I was serious about liking podcasts. Like,
Yeah, no, absolutely, man. But thank you again, man. Thank you.
take care. Have a good one.